The year 793 opened with omens over the north of England. That's how one English chronicle remembers it. Whirlwinds, sheets of light, fiery dragons seen flying through the air, and after them a famine. And then in June, ships. They came out of the open sea to Lindisfarne, a small tidal island off the Northumbrian coast where monks had prayed since the 630s. And the men who came ashore plundered the church, killed some of the monks, dragged others off in chains, and sailed away. Word reached the court of Charlemagne, where the Northumbrian scholar Alcuin served as advisor to the Frankish king and taught in the palace school. Alcuin wrote home to the king of Northumbria in grief, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race, nor was it thought that such an inroad from the sea could be made." The church of St. Cuthbert, he wrote, stood spattered with the blood of the priests of God. Nobody standing in that wreckage could have guessed how the story ends. 300 years later, the descendants of the raiders were building churches of their own, and a king of Norway was sailing a war fleet to Jerusalem. This is the story of how the Vikings became Christians, and it runs through a red-hot iron, a silver coin, and a man lying silent under a cloak. The men in the ships weren't monsters, and they weren't atheists. They had gods of their own. Odin, who traded an eye for wisdom. Thor, whose hammer guarded the farm and the family. Gods, woven into oath-taking, harvest, burial, and kingship. Attacking a monastery wasn't rebellion against the Christian God. As they saw it, they had never sworn allegiance to him. What they saw in Lindisfarne was a warehouse of silver on an undefended beach, kept by an unfortified monastic community. And because the raids worked, they spread Iona, the Irish coasts, the river mouths of France, year after year for generations. In the Frankish churches, they sang a new line into their prayers: "Deliver us, God, from the savage race of Northmen which lays waste our realms." And while the church prayed, it did something that looks, from the beach at Lindisfarne, almost absurd. It sent missionaries into the countries the ships came from. In 826, a young monk named Anskar went north in the company of an exiled Danish king and started a school at Hedeby, a Danish trading town. The king was driven out within the year. 3 years later, Anskar pushed on to Birka, a market island in a Swedish lake, and gathered a small congregation. The local king's own steward was among the first members. On a later mission, around 850, he was given permission to build a church at Hedeby. Anskar kept at that work for nearly 40 years and died in his bed in 865, honored ever after as the Apostle of the North. Then most of what he'd planted withered, and Denmark and Sweden stayed pagan. Anskar's first Danish mission had failed, but now the church knew the road. England is where the tide first turned. By the 860s, the raids had become invasions. A great Danish army conquered Northumbria, East Anglia, and more, and in 869 it killed Edmund, the young king of East Anglia, a tradition says, because he refused to renounce Christ. One English kingdom was left standing, and in 878, its king, Alfred of Wessex, beat the Danish leader Guthrum in battle after a winter in which everything said he was finished. The peace terms included Guthrum's baptism. 3 weeks after the battle, the Viking king came to Alfred with 30 of his men and was baptized. And Alfred stood as his godfather, his sponsor before God, and gave him a Christian name, Athelstan. That was politics, of course, a beaten king buying peace. But something else was moving among the thousands of Danes who settled eastern England. Within about 30 years, Scandinavian rulers in East Anglia were issuing pennies in Saint Edmund's name. The king their own army had killed was now the saint their coinage honored. Trade was doing the same quiet work everywhere. A Norse merchant who wanted to do business in Christian towns could accept a halfway rite, the sign of the cross, short of baptism, that made him acceptable company for Christian partners while he made up his mind. Archaeologists digging in Denmark found a 10th century soapstone mold that cast crosses and Thor's hammer amulets side by side, and for a generation or two, the North wore both. Then the king started deciding. Around the 960s, a priest named Poppo, standing before Harald Bluetooth, king of Denmark, was pressed to prove that Christ was God and not just one God among many. The story comes from a German chronicler writing in those same years, and he answered by carrying a glowing iron in his bare hand and showing the hand unhurt. Harald ordered Christ worshipped as the only God. He was himself baptized. And beside the two great mounds at Jelling, he raised a great carved stone in memory of his parents. It still stands, and had cut into it that he had won for himself all Denmark and Norway, and made the Danes Christian. A king's boast on a stone runs ahead of the facts, what the making took another century of church building, but the direction was set by the crown. Norway's turn came harder. Olaf Tryggvason had grown rich raiding England, and in 994, as part of a peace treaty, he was received into the church at Andover, with the English king himself standing sponsor. A promise came with it, and he kept it. He never attacked England again. The next year, he seized the throne of Norway and set about converting it the way he'd done everything else in his life, fast and by force. Assemblies were offered baptism or the king's wrath. Idols came down, and the sagas remember men who refused him and were tortured and killed for it. 5 years into the work, Olaf died in a sea battle, and the conversion stopped where the fear of him stopped. Iceland in that same stretch, the year 1000 or 999, the old reckonings allow either, did something no other nation in this story did. It converted by decision of an assembly. Our earliest account of that day was written by an Icelandic historian about a century afterward, from the memories of men one generation removed from it. The island had no king. Its free farmers made law together each summer at a national gathering called the Althing. Pressure from Olaf's Norway was heavy, and the island's Christians and pagans had come to the edge of splitting into two peoples under two laws. Instead, both sides agreed to let one man decide for everyone. Thorgir, the law speaker, the elected man who carried the whole law in his memory, and himself a pagan priest. He lay down under his cloak and stayed there in silence for a day and a night. When he rose, he said that if the law were torn in two, the peace would tear with it. One law, one land, and the law would be Christian. All were to be baptized. The old rites could be kept quietly in private for a time. Then Thorgir went and was baptized himself. A second Olaf gave the faith the force of law. Olaf Haraldsson, king from 1015, brought bishops in from England, made Christianity the kingdom's only permitted religion, and gave it a national legal structure, enforced with the same iron his predecessor had used. His enemies, and he'd made many for reasons that were as much about power as about gods, drove him from the country. When he came back in 1030, an army of his own countrymen killed him at Stiklestad on the 29th of July. Within a year came reports of healings at his grave. A bishop declared him a saint, and the very farmers who had fought him took him as their own. Norway drew its patron saint from the battlefield where Norwegians killed him. Sweden went last. In the 1070s, a German churchman could still describe, from travelers' reports, a great heathen temple at Uppsala, with images of Thor and Odin, and sacrifices hanging in a sacred grove. Later, saga tradition says that the Christian king Ingi destroyed the temple in the 1080s. By about 1100, Christianity was the public religion through most of Scandinavia, though Sweden's conversion remained incomplete into the 12th century. In 1107, Sigurd, king of Norway, sailed a fleet to the Holy Land on crusade, the armed pilgrimage that had captured Jerusalem 8 years earlier, and fought alongside Baldwin, the crusader king there, helping him take Sidon. By most reckonings, he was the first king in all of Europe to go crusading in person. Those conversions don't all look alike. Some of this was conviction, a merchant weighing what he'd seen in Christian towns, a law speaker under a cloak choosing peace. Some of it was a treaty term, and some of it was terror. Olaf Tryggvason's converts were made at the edge of a blade. A sword can change what a country practices. It can't change what a heart believes, and the church's own missionaries knew the difference, which is why the slow work of priests and parishes and teaching went on for 100 years after every royal decree. Judged across the 3 centuries, the slow work is what held. The men who took the treaty put a martyred king's name on their money. The grandchildren of men baptized under threat built churches on their own land with their own hands, and laid another martyred king's bones under an altar. So the old chant was answered, though not in the way the monks who sang it meant. God did not deliver Europe from the Northmen. He delivered the Northmen. 300 years after that morning on the island, the same ships went out of the north again, and this time they carried a king of Norway to Jerusalem.